lunchtime to pursue these things at greater length. But right now, David Lovekin, just retired from Hastings College in Nebraska, is the author of the longest article in the history of the Ellul Forum in our most recent issue. But David is going to speak to us now on, let's see, what do we call this paper here? The problem of technology as a symbolic form. And David, here are the time cards are here. And so periodically you see this yellow thing flashing.
Do I have a minute before I start the clock?
Yes.
Can you get the mic?
Oh, that's right.
Hold on for a lot. I'm not going to do what I said I was going to do in my abstract. I started out to write about Casir and Vico and Ellul, and it was too much of a difficulty. Not a difficulty, but I wouldn't want to hear it. You might want to read it. So I decided to write a paper that you might want to hear and see how that goes. What I said about Vico, Casir, and Ellul can be found Technique, Discourse, and Consciousness. I wrote this book some years ago. I'm still mining it. I've heard you only write one book and then figure out what it meant, and I think that's what I'm doing there. I sent a manual copy to Ellul, by the way. It's not really the dissertation, and he enjoyed it a great deal, talking about encouraging a philosopher, and he thought that I needed to work much more on the problem of the cliche. He thought this would be my contribution. So, again, the Ellul Forum is my latest thinking about aesthetic issues and about the idea of a symbolic form. I think that philosophy needs to move away from the analysis of language and logic in the ordinary sense and move it to the extraordinary sense, which means understanding the notion of the symbol in a deep and profound way. So that's my introduction. And now I will try to blend la fond et la durée. Two times together. Technology and the further humiliation of the word. The question of technology is the accumulation of gadgets and tools, perhaps considered as the outgrowth of science, and is culminating in the machines of the Industrial Revolution, avoids a serious question. How did tools and machines and societies that use them become obsessed with absolute efficiency and with reduction of means to a mathematics like exactness? Technology currently determines scientific advance. Machines, use itself, are made regardless of the usefulness that became independent of cultural values. Cultural values instead seem determined by the advances of technique. Ellul, in his La Technique ou l'enjeu du siècle, broke with the tradition of seeing technology as present in every culture in any historical moment, and conflating it merely with material advance, and understood it as a specific mentality culminating around 1750, a technical intention, he calls it, une intention technique. His social and theological analyses came together with the understanding that this intention privileged the image over the word, the concept over the process, and a reconfigured profane that became the new sacred. Technique, in Ellul's sense, issued a return to a mythical dimension that belied technology, that belied technology's origins in reason and conceptual analysis. The technological order signaled a return to a sacred order. The return raises an essential mystery which I do not pretend to solve, but only to authenticate. The mystery is confounded by the marvelous enlightenment claims of reason and the understanding that would enable progress and peace. We may invoke Spinoza's sensibility. Do not hate or despise, but understand. For him, geometrical truths provided the most proximate relation to God's mind and body, in which our minds and bodies were expressions. Thus, the otherness between ourselves and the other disappeared in Spinoza's rational faith, but reappeared as reason proved insufficient. Reason could balance equations, but also produce weapons of mass destruction to effect a jihad or a preemptive military strike. Flying planes into the Twin Towers, burning Jews and bombing abortion clinics technologically planned and executed were nonetheless faith-based initiatives. Nonetheless, the Enlightenment, faith, and reason continues, typically finding fault with the non-scientific. The New York Times bestseller, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason, Sam Harris applies philosophical and neuroscientific skills to the problems of faith operating without the leash of reason. He claims nothing is more sacred than the facts. To his credit, he is no naive realist who believes in the truly objective, not subjectively known. Knowing involves consciousness, which mostly takes place, his understanding, of the duality of subject standing in relation to its object. Although the I is never purely found. But he adds, it actually disappears when looked for in the right way. Harris does not explain for whom this disappearance would take place. Again, undeterred, the self struggles of the various objects and contexts to discover and to quantify the true, although the work would be hard. With this work, faith is brought to task. He states, where we have reasons for what we believe, we have no need of faith. Where we have no reasons, we have lost our connections to the world and to one another. Reason occupies, for Harris, a privileged place, which would raise the following questions. Are facts really sacred? Would this be held a priority? Would reason be able to deter the suicide bomber? If so, we should draw copies of the Critique of Pure Reason instead of smart bombs. Kant, however, required a qualified reason tied to the categories and to the sensuous forms of intuition. Understanding forms of consciousness, I contend, involves more than an examination of reason, with which consciousness is often conflated. The critique of reason requires a critique of culture. Since Descartes has become the pattern to identify being with thinking and thinking with reason and rational reflection. Staying to this path, we would have excluded Descartes' own powerful persona, the mauvais génie, or the evil genius, which enabled Descartes to imagine the possibility that nothing made sense, which in turn led to his first clear and distinct idea, that the I appeared every time he thought, doubted. The I, however, did more than doubt, as the history of philosophy after Descartes attempted to explain. The Cartesian philosophy, his method, was everywhere applied, as Ellul noted, going beyond the philosophical bounds, showing the technique was and is indeed a mentality, a Cartesian-like mentality infinitely applied and mandated, without, of course, Descartes' genius. In his discussion of the historical and sociological dimensions of technique, Ellul is more than a historian and a sociologist. Techniques appeared in every primitive societies as magic, in which, prior to technique, quoting Ellul, everything is of a piece. Nothing can be meddled with or modified without threat to the whole structure of beliefs and activities. The world of the primitive was not without logic and understanding, although it was devoid of the assumptions required for technique. Following anthropologist Louis Roux, Ellul writes, technique is a cloak for men, a kind of cosmic vestment. In his conflict with matter, in his struggle to survive, man interposes an intermediary agency between himself and his environment. End quote. With this agency, humanity has protection and defense, but also the ability to assimilate and transform. Ellul offers similar words about the nature of the symbol. He wrote, without mediating symbols, humanity would invariably be destroyed by raw physical contact alone. The other is always the enemy, the menace. The other represents an invasion of the personal world, unless or until the relationship is normalized through symbolization. To speak the same language is to recognize the other has entered into the common interpretive universe. End quote. With this separation of subject and object in an imaginative act, an other world is created. Thus, otherness and the imagination jumpstart this creation, which takes place in and with language that is at first magical and religious simultaneously. The wholeness of the world and its transcendent powers that kept technique in check were challenged by Greek rationality, Roman law, and Christianity were further weights and balances on technique that had to be transformed. The world and the transcendent were still others. Tools and incantations extended human desire and understanding, but truth, beauty, goodness, justice, and God's word kept them in place. A long period of technical development, a growing population, the invention of economy, here money, of course, became the medium of exchange, and hence a world-ordering symbol, and an apparent leveling of traditional hierarchies helped technical intention and rationality to flower. Technical mentality and the mental required otherness to work against to produce the technical phenomenon. Human history is littered with technical operations that were means to accomplish ends, often characterized by tools extending from the body and the cultures from which they are variously adapted, and that were equated with the techniques produced by reason. With the advent of technical consciousness, Ellul insists, quote, is no longer the best relative means which counts. The choice is less and less a subjective one among several means. It is really a question of finding the best means in the absolute sense on the basis of numerical calculation, end quote. The product was the technical phenomenon, the embodiments of technical consciousness initially appearing as symbolic expressions. The otherness of the body and the world upon which and in which it operated was transformed by consciousness and framed conceptually. Technological culture would then be understood as concepts objectified as natural objects were conceptualized. Qualitative otherness became quantitative. Ellul's notion of the technical rationality is crucial in identifying technology in its social order as an altered symbolism. In the following, I quote, in the following quote, I add in brackets a clause that was left out in Ellul's very Wilkins's translation of the Technological Society. This is Ellul. In technique, whatever its aspect of the domain in which it is applied, a rational process is present which tends to bring mechanics to bear on all that is spontaneous or irrational. This rationality, best exemplified in systematization, division of labor, creation of standards, production norms, and the like, involves two distinct phases. First, the use of discourse in every operation. This is what's been left out under the two aspects this term can take. On the one hand, the intervention of intentional reflection, and on the other hand, the intervention of means from one term to the other. This excludes spontaneity and personal creativity. Second, there is a reduction of method to its logical dimension alone. Every intervention of technique is in effect a reduction of facts, forces, phenomena, means, and instruments to the scheme of logic. Technical reason requires discourse and method reduced to the schemes of logic. This is the emphasis. Logic would demand adherence to the principle of identity and non-contradiction. For something to be, it must be what it is and not what it is not. Bodies and other natural objects are often what they are not without the rational gaze. Descartes' burning candle, both gaseous and solid, both liquid and fire, became extension with his second clear and distinct idea. Extension was what all physical bodies were in essence as a fact for science, although extension was an abstraction for other eyes, especially for those trying to read from it. Extension is the object in concept, an identity eschewing difference. It has meaning in scientific and technical discourse. This concept is an identity eschewing all difference. The logic of technique, as Ellul explains in his characterology, is to reduce all objects and processes to these essentials, with the resulting irony that this perfection is never fully achieved by definition. Soap is never fully soap, while grocery aisles are crammed full of it. The object is never beautiful enough, efficient enough, good enough. Absolute efficiency is the goal of the process, perpetually unfulfilled. This is the opposite of the physicist's definition of efficiency, where a minimum of work produces the maximum of effect. The result is what I would term a series of bad infinities. Hegel says Schlechten Endlichkeit. The efficient becomes either not this one or not any of them. The former is an endless finitude, while the latter is an empty class. Here the label or the image in this embarrassment becomes the real thing in an attempt to cancel endless finitude or bloodless category. Recall that Coke, not the drink, is the real thing. The consciousness examines each process, each object seeking absolute efficiency. The technical phenomenon appears almost automatically in a geometric rather than an arithmetic growth. Below, no limitations are allowed. What can be done will be done. Mantra known to all cultures, a true universal. Oddly, this becomes unconscious. The object made is no longer known as made. The distinction between the subject and object collapses. Few remember that whipped cream used to come from cows. From Latin, we can learn that fact comes from factum, which means made, something done or performed. We have forgotten this meaning and have reduced facts to truth, to a sacred. Like technical phenomena, they seem to pop directly from Zeus's head. The subject collapses into the object and technical autonomy reigns. Reason has disappeared with no otherness to confront and to mediate, and so is the symbol. The language of the ancients, the language of myth, biblical language, comes alive in the symbol and metaphor. Myths for Ellul are not false stories, but instead aim at the truth. He says, when I use the word myth, I mean this: the addition of the theological significance to a fact which itself has no meaning. It is therefore to make a fact meaningful, to show it up as bearing a revelation of God. God, as the holy other, resists a mere presence in an image, but appears only in the word that suggests his word. Further, quote, myth is born of the revealed word of God, and because it is figurative, it has no visible image. As the highest expression of the word, it reaches the edge and the very limit of the expressible, the ineffable, and the unspeakable. Unquote. For example, Ellul notes, the city, Yer, or else Yer, Rem. Now this word has several meanings. And not only is the city, but also the watching angel, the vengeance and terror, a strange separation of ideas that Ellul writes. In the figurative, identities are created with important differences, opposed meanings that are meaningful when they are put together. In violation, of course, of technical logic. The city had not only material power, but spiritual power, which was apprehended in the metaphorical grasp of the imagination in the face of the other. Ellul reminds, we forget all too easily that imagination is the basic characteristic of intelligence, so that a society in which people lose their capacity to conjure up symbols also loses its inventiveness and its ability to act. The imagination is embodied speech, he notes, from which I conclude that the body disappears in technique, so it disappears in its bodily expression, in metaphors and symbols. One could say the reason is language has lost its birth in myth and in the force of the imagination, where the meaningful first appears as an image or presence that is at the same time more than it appears. In this way, the image provides a path for the fact to become sacred that gives birth to religion, art, philosophy, and science, but which also must be transcended in meaning that goes beyond the moment. When technique becomes the sacred, the other forms of knowing have no power. This presence of the technical sacred order produces a loss of meaning, which may be why myth and primitive religions gain cultural weight. Ellul insists that the true Christianity is not religion, but in the opposition of meanings that claim to be imminently absolute, a condition only held by God. Ellul states that two forms of language exist in any state, the language of hearing and the language of seeing. Language begins in the act of pointing to or seeing what in the space of the present, and the certainty of the image that inhabits the realm of the real. The image is certain. It has no contradiction. It is what it is. The word, a puff of wind, at least, is the domain that surrounds. A strange sound produces anxious eyes. The word is ambiguous, a moment of mystery and intrigue that reaches for the true, he calls the brag. Only the word troubles the water. And further, the visual reality is non-contradictory. You can say that a piece of paper is both red and blue, but you cannot see it as both red and blue at the same time. The philosophical laws of thought, he will notes, are visually based. Plato's idea related to the eidolon are cases in point, but as Plato insisted that ordinary ties to the visual had to be broken. In the absence of the word and the symbol, cliches abound. The cliche is the machine in its new suit. The word inhabits history and place, the image does not. The history of the word, in the history of the word, cliche is forgotten. According to the OED, cliche appeared around 1832 and referred to a stereotype block, a printer's cast, or dab. It began as in the visual dimension, but the word was also a variant of cliquet, meaning to click, likely referring to the sound of the lead pieces as they were struck. The auditory dimension is lost in the modern sense, which is no longer the metaphor that was suggested. A worn-out expression was left, and the truth behind the word was abandoned. Things are worse, however. Henry J. Frankfurt in On Bullshit claims that lying and misrepresentation are out of fashion. Politicians and pundits may in fact lie, but the lie is not the issue. Truth or falsity are no longer the concerns. Lying or telling the truth are both permitted as long as a favorable impression is achieved. The bullshitter wants to be believed, and those susceptible want to believe regardless of the truth. Recently, Rick Santorum claimed that the elderly in Holland had to wear bracelets to keep from being euthanized. Of course, there were no facts to back this up and likely no concern for the truth that might substantiate them. Romney made a statement that was challenged, and he allowed that he didn't recall what he said, but he was sure he would stand by it. I am certain that bullshit transcends party lines. This is, by the way, the title of Frankfurt's book, on Bullshit. Frankfurt adds that the need for figures to appear before the public who appearing knowledgeable increases bullshit. In another scenario, convinced that reality has no inherent nature, which he might hope to identify as the truth about things, he devotes to being true to his own nature. This breeds the cult of sincerity, bullshit on the face of it. If there is no truth to nature, why would the individual be privy to it? Ellul was close to the notion of bullshit with his n'importe quoi, his understanding that ultimate value in aesthetics is whatever, or bullshit. So the technical phenomenon, in fact, really ends in bullshit.
Interesting place to end. So who has a comment or a question? Let's take a couple before we move on to the next phase here. But thank you, David.
Yeah.
Say your name and then make your statement. Yes.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Peter Ducini, Elmhurst College, the author of that book you had just mentioned.
Mary J. Frankfurt.
Franklin? Like
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt.
Yeah.
Okay.
He wrote a follow-up to it called On Truth, which is interesting because in it he struggles with the problem of the relation between fact and the truth. At one point he says they're absolutely commensurate, and then at another point he says he's not quite sure because some facts might seem more truth than others. But then, to ultimately justify what he was doing, he quotes a poem. Quotes Adrienne Rich and also Shakespeare. Fascinating kind of business.
Incredible.
Just a random Ireland, Carleton University. Just a comment, short, that On Bullshit was a bestseller. On Truth. Bullshit about bullshit.
Why wouldn't it be? And of course, I think the Frankfurt book is interesting because he was born in the analytic tradition, which I suffered through. And the thing that you never quite see is, why can't we just state straight away there are at least four notions of truth? Which one do you want? I mean, we have the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, the utilitarian theory, and the mystical and intuitive theory. And all four, in a way, have place, of course, their practice. In the end, I opt for the coherence theory of truth in the sense that Hegel, I think, meant it when he said, das Wahre ist das Ganze, the true is the whole, not the truth. And so that, of course, I don't read Hegel as an absolute idealist. It's nonsense.
Okay, over here.
Nick Evans, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. How does the political illusion, the book itself, kind of play into, your aspects of, let's say, bullshit, or, let's say your example of Romney, where, in that sense, wouldn't the political illusion, wouldn't he have, emphasize in there that they're just being efficient in what they're trying to be efficient in what they say, in a sense, where the political actor really is subjugated to the scientist, where the scientist, would say what is most efficient and what to do, and then as an actor, a political actor, the Romney or the elected official would simply do what the most efficient result might actually be. So in a sense, they're disambiguated from their own acts, so to speak. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Well, I don't want to lose my amateur status. Well, amateurs are lovers of things, so I don't want to take too many professions. But what was important for me in the illusion of the political illusion was the distinction between Lovekin and Lovekin, which Ellul says gets lost, which is again germane to my interest in reading the power of the metaphor behind any reasonable thinker. I mean, not reasonable in the highest sense. For instance, law politic is the discussion of the values that transcend the business of conducting the state. And law politic is the business, the erector side of politics. And of course, I think the thesis of political illusion is law politic is triumph. But I think the bullshit has taken things even worse. I mean, we're not talking about people that are manipulating for any good reason at all. We're talking about people that are manipulated only to gain power, whatever the hell that might be. And who knows, whatever, I think is what I'm saying. Eric.
Yeah, actually, another comment about theories of truth from perspective of Hegel, the truth, the whole. We have these variety of choices, standard choices in philosophy, correspondence theory, coherence theory, things like that. I was wondering, and this is a theme in Ellul that comes up quite often, where we're left with this tension usually, right, between the image and the word. We're kind of caught between them, or between being incarnated and disincarnated. And the whole structure of Ellul's work, sociology on the one hand, theology on the other. I'm wondering if there's some kind of dialectical theory of truth that we could get into that leaves us in this tension, but there's something that somebody we could call one kind of tension true versus another kind false in some sense. That goes beyond coherence. See, coherence is a little comforting to me, right? To have coherence of a structure or a system that Hegel tends to provide. I'm just wondering if you see more tension in Ellul than Hegel on that.
Well, yeah, in certain readings of Hegel, certainly, but not in my reading of it. I don't want to break my amateur status in any of this amateur philosophy. There's no question that Belgium did not invade Germany. No question. Whatever one would say about World War II, that's a fact. But it's also true that there's more we can say about it. This is always the problem. This is why I thought the genius of certain members of the idealist faction in America, Brand Blanchard, I think, his book on the nature of thoughts, still the best thing alive. And Errol Harris also brought, I think, Hegel to at least in my sensibility, more reasonable sort. I think the whole notion that the true is the whole, it vitiates the notion that the truth can never be the whole, and I think that's important. read it, part of Lowell's dialectical understanding. And I think that's the genius of the idea that says Christianity's failure is that it became a religion.
Okay, thank you, David. After our next paper, we're going to take a break to get some coffee and roll around and that sort of thing. But now our third paper is from Samir Yunus, who's a professor at the School of Architecture at Notre Dame for the last 20 or so years. And his talk is on technique and artistic imitation and invention. Samir.